we are beginning with Caleb Parkin is going to present first. And Caleb, and this is one of the best descriptions I've ever had from a bio I've had to read out. Thank you, Caleb. Caleb is a dayglow, queero, techno, eco poet and facilitator. He's based in Bristol. He won the second prize in the National Poetry Competition in 2016, first in the Winchester Poetry Prize in 2017. His work is published in The Rialto, The Poetry Review, Under the Radar, Butcher's Dog, Coast to Coast to Coast, Tentacular, Finnish Creatures, and Molly Bloom. He tutors for the Poetry Society, Poetry School, and First Story. In 2019, he completed an MSc in creative writing for therapeutic purposes through Metanoa Institute and was awarded Arts Council funding to explore queer eco-poetry in his first collection. And it's also really worth noting that Caleb has just been made Bristol's first city poet for 2020 to 2022. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Caleb's work and just not to give too much away. But Caleb is working on a really fascinating collector. And he has developed a really incredible approach, raising really important questions about who and what gets included in museums, collections and archives, and what fails to be valued, appreciated, preserved and seen. We know that queer and trans history is often a history of loss, erasure and failure. And Caleb's work speaks in fascinating ways to these broader themes. So I'm going to hand over to Caleb now, and we will find out about his work.
Hello everyone, I was just trying to unmute myself. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and I'm going to share my screen in a second to give a presentation. Behind me I've got some close-up sand, because sand is really significant in what I've been doing, and so I'm going to start my presentation and then I'm going to swap the sand in the background on my green screen in a moment. So here we go. Can everyone see that? You can give me a little jazz hand if you can, that's all good. Okay, so I want to talk about rejected gay sand poetry and queer failure today for Queering a Museum. So as Nat said, I'm a poet, performer, filmmaker, facilitator. I'm interested in museums and writing for well-being. And through the dissertation I did for my MSc Creative Writing for Therapeutic Purposes, became quite interested also in decolonizing practices and ways that writing can speak back to a museum's collection. I'm also very interested in queer eco-poetry, and my first collection is out next October with 9 arches called This Fruiting Body, and there's a lot of queer eco work in there. And that's kind of part of the work I've been doing with RAMM. Okay, so this is, I was going to have this as my background, but I can't figure out how to do it right now. So what did I want to say about this? So I started looking at the RAMM archive, particularly thinking around natural history in the natural history archives. And I wanted to think whether we could queer the museum decolonially, which is another strand to the work, where I've been looking at this book I've had from my grandma, which is a book of our South African national parks tobacco cards, which is a very loaded object I've discovered, but that's going to be next year. So trolling around the RAMM natural history catalogues, I came across these sand samples and found them really interesting and kind of noticed their existing poetry. Sand is a wonderful image. I noticed that Yana said, you know, she used this like digging into the research term. And also that 2020 in some way has been a bit of a sand castle, hasn't it? I don't know, it's like something we're constantly building things and they get washed away. And so I think sand has inherent kind of poetic potential. And of course, Ivor Treby, who collected these sand samples, I felt really interested by, and perhaps some kind of kinship, some kind of posthumous kinship with Ivor Treby that I wanted to explore further and find out more about. So Ivor C, Treby, who's born 1933, died in 2012. So I feel like we just missed each other. He was a gay man whose formative years were spent during the period when homosexual life was illegal in the UK. He was out to his parents and also to his colleagues at the time of his arrest for public indecency in 1977, a charge which endangered but did not end his teaching career. This is from the Bodleian, by the way, where lots of his archive is. And he considered himself a gay literary activist, which I really love as a term. And I found this other aspect of his biog really interesting. He had an interest in gay men's experience in the 20th century, ranging from a friendship with an elderly man who was a connection to Edwardian gay life, to Treby's own recorded memories of cottaging and bathhouses in London. There's some really fun stuff with the sands that he collected, including the ones I'll talk about, which were the sands that were rejected from the collection for not being the right kind of sand, where he collected sand from quite a few archaeological bathhouses. And I really love that he had this playfulness about what he collected and where he collected it from. Also that he had this sense of a queer lineage with this elderly gentleman from, you know, he lived through Edwardian gay life. And so I guess like I quite like that idea of a queer lineage. Okay, so Treby sand. It wasn't intended for RAMM. It was actually left in his will, which I'll show you in a second, to the Bodleian, to the Oxford Library. So in that sense, it's already a kind of failure, which is a joy. Not all of the sand is interesting enough or fits with the museum's collection policy. I love the idea of what is and what isn't interesting sand. I don't know, like, where does that value come from? Why was he collecting this sand? Don't know. Like, I feel like we can kind of speculate, and I want to do some more kind of research with the Bodleian to actually maybe join it up with some of his biography. I sort of do and I don't, because I also quite like it just being mysterious object. And I was kind of thinking with Treby about degrees of privilege. You know, he was a biochemist and he went traveling a great deal. And so in that sense, he did have quite a lot of privilege. He could go off and collect this sand and then keep it all. And he really fastidiously kept this sand and labeled it. And as I said before, they're kind of coded objects because some of them I feel like have this other subtext about them to do with where he collected them. So his bequest was to RAMM. Well, actually, it was to the Bodleian. But so at the top here, it says that he wanted it to go to the University Museum of Parks Road, Oxford, etc. But if that museum will not accept this bequest, it should go to RAMM, Devon, in remembrance of my maternal grandfather, Charles Hayes, a sailor who died in the Great War and a native of that fine city. So there was some sense of lineage for him there too, as well, I noticed. So I just tried a quick blackout poem using this bit of his will, which is a public document, by the way. I'm not showing anything confidential, which is give sand, always the city maternal and fine. And I was thinking actually that I really like blackout poetry as a kind of queer form in its erasure, its hiddenness, and this way that it can speak back to power and officialdom. And I really love blackout poems and use them in a lot of groups. And this kind of made me think about why perhaps I use them. Also, what I really love is that this was a kind of sand ambush on RAMM because they didn't know that this was coming. And then the sand just turned up. This is my understanding from Holly at the museum, and Ellie, you can probably comment on this, but it just turned up. So it didn't go to the Bodleian, and then RAMM have just got this sand, and it's like, what do we do with it now? You know, and not all of it is kind of sufficiently interesting. So queer failure, this wonderful term that Jana, I think, introduced me to, I've heard before and have kind of got into a bit more depth with. I feel like I'm at early days thinking about it in my own practice and in, you know, with these objects. So one definition that Jack Halberstam, who wrote The Queer Art of Failure, gives is other subordinate, queer or counter-hegemonic modes of common sense lead to the association of failure with non-conformity, anti-capitalist practices, non-reproductive lifestyles, negativity, and critique. And there's a potential there for kind of quite a lot of liberation as well, I think, with queer failure. And so I've been thinking about it in terms of this sand and my own practice and the practice of poets who I like and admire as well, actually. So starting to identify some queer failure. So what RAMM did was they sent me this spreadsheet of rejected gay sand, and it was, I think, entitled the spreadsheet of rejected gay sand in and also the rejects table. And now the rejects table instantly made me think of emails with the "you can't sit with us." You can't sit with us. You know, where are we allowed to sit? Where are we not allowed to sit? Who are we allowed to sit with? And this sand was not allowed to sit with main collection. Some of the sand was collected and catalogued, and others were not. And it was this sand I was interested in. You know, and of course, sand has all this stuff around fragmentariness, about authenticity, both in terms of, I don't know, like where this sand came from, like what's authentic, what's organic or inorganic. Is organic more authentic than inorganic? I mean, I don't know. About collection and disposal, it made me think of, you know, what we keep, what we get rid of. That might also speak to kind of what we keep and get rid of in terms of our habits, behaviors, things like that too. And of course, about finding, collecting and curating. Treby was obviously the collector and curator. And on the right here, there is this, oh, I've got a pointer, there we go. This is just a bit of the sand spreadsheet, which again, I'm allowed to share, it's fine, I checked. And it tells you where it came from, the file number, and then it gives this beautiful description of the sand, which I felt like was already poetry and has this real kind of shipping forecast quality. And if anyone saw the video I sent out beforehand, I was just reading the sand descriptions because I love them as found poetry. So I started thinking about rejected gay sand fridge poetry. I was going to make GIFs because I love GIFs. I think they're what the internet was invented for. And instead I thought, actually, you know, fridge poetry is great for sand. It's particular, you know, it moves around. And so here's what I did on Google Draw from a template, a literacy template a nice teacher made. And the poem I made was "Sweep the sun-kissed subangular alluvial charcoal, suggest this transparent tickle matrix." And I really like the transparent tickle matrix. For some reason that really appealed to me. So yeah, and I kind of hope that maybe one day this could become like a real object in the RAMM space, because I think fridge poetry and sand, rejected gay sand, could just be a real joy for people to play with. Yeah, I've been thinking about queer failure and poetry and thinking about which poems I enjoy, and then thinking, where is the queer failure in some of the work I enjoy? And I realised there's quite a lot of it. This is Colin Hurd, who's a Scottish poet, who I read his book recently, which is called You Name It. And here it is, You Name It, on Dostoevsky Wannabe, who are a really good experimental publisher. And I love his anti-endings, and there's a kind of artful unsatisfactoriness to the poems, which is strangely enjoyable. So in this one, which is called Hesitation Cocktail, the end of the poem goes, business is sluggish, people are sloppy, and I haven't even thought about a garnish. And it's this kind of weird banal afterthought that refuses to be kind of poem end like, and I really enjoyed that. The Chinese American poet Chen Chen, who I really recommend if you don't know his work, he's wonderful. This is some of the titles and some excerpts of his work. So titles include Self-Portrait as So Much Potential. And his collection is called When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a List of Further Possibilities. And for me, I was like, oh, there's a real kind of joyous queer failure in this. A couple of other poem openings of his. I'm not a religious person, but God sent me an angel, one of his least qualified though, fluent only in let me get back to you. The angel sounded like me, early 20s, unpaid interning, proficient in fetching coffee, sending super vague emails. It got so bad, God personally had to speak to me. And from Poplar Street, there's this hesitant kind of voice that corrects itself. Oh, sorry, hello. Are you on your way to work too? I was just taken aback by how you also have a briefcase, also small and brown. I was taken by how you seem secretly to love everything. Are you my new co-worker? Oh, I see. No. So do look up his work because it's beautiful, and it's full of this hesitance that I think perhaps comes from being both a migrant and a queer poet. And I think it's beautiful. So more poets I'd like to explore this in: Gertrude Stein, Frank O'Hara, Eileen Miles, contemporary poet Caroline Bird, I think, has quite a lot of queer failure and would really embrace the term too. I found this Troublemakers, Poetics of Flippancy. And I thought, yes, flippancy as well. And it's kind of, I was really pleased to find this text. So there's a little quote from it. So Jack Halberstam writes that failure is a way of refusing to acquiesce to dominant logics of power and discipline as a form of critique. As a practice, failure recognizes that alternatives are embedded already in the dominant. Rather than reproducing the dominant, as in the case of irony, a failure of commitment is a means by which to recognize alternatives to and escape routes from the dominant. As Halberstam writes, under certain circumstances, failing, losing, forgetting, unmaking, undoing, unbecoming, not knowing may in fact offer more creative, more cooperative, more surprising ways of being in the world. I love all the unwords and I use them all the time, I've realized. And then goes on to talk more about flippancy as another way of producing this, more interesting ways of being in the world. And so I think in good time, this is my fourth rejected gay sand, the spreadsheet of rejected gay sand poem, in which I address Ivor Cutler. The epigraphs are largely verbatim from the descriptions of the sand, so museum language as poetry. I have a hesitance that I'm not sure whether this isn't colonizing Andean shamanic rituals or queering ritual, or I don't know. That's there, so maybe that's a failure. But I hope there's no cultural offense or appropriation here in the way I've kind of represented it as part of my research. And also what I love is the note of doubt in the description of the sand here. Was it even really from Machu Picchu, which I really enjoyed and I reference in my poem. Okay. So file 165, altar of earth spirit, Machu Picchu, Peru. Miscellaneous recent plant and mollusk debris, biotite, sparse light brown cleavage plates, subangular pebble, mick mineralogy corresponds with the granite rock of Machu Picchu. Weakly cemented soil-like clumps could indicate the material sampled is not in situ. Dear Ivor, let's imagine a ritual. The Andeans make a land payment offering to Pachamama, Mother Earth. The internet says Andean shamans are sometimes called vegetalistas or just maestros of plant lore. To pay Pachamama, you wrap up offerings of chicha liquor, coca leaves, alpaca meat, potato. Then the maestro would burn them, sending their smoke, asking, please, please. But we're not maestros, you and I, are we? I've never even seen your sand, your face, communing over time and space through a spreadsheet of what's been chucked away. And I notice, Ivor, the mistrust of your soil-like clumps, a phrase I'm trying not to giggle at, something flushed. Were you ever even there, Ivor, at the altar of the earth spirit? Were we ever even here in these spurious records, these wary documents? Here's what we'll do, Ivor. We'll magic this sand back from wherever it went, unmixed and extracted, subtracted exactly the specific particulate blend of each unique sand sample. Every file filed again, stacked in rows on this spreadsheet like a tacky holiday souvenir, layered behind this glass screen. We'll stack them all up, Ivor, an earthy rainbow made. Then we'll raise it up ahead and smash it right in the middle of the internet. We'll be biotite and subangular pebbles. We'll be plant and mollusk debris. We'll clump in the corners of databases and servers, appeasing Pachamama together, you and me, and all the other rejects in files and test tubes. I'll join you in the sandstorm of language in the ground. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry for running slightly over.
Thank you so much, Caleb. I have written lots of gorgeous phrases and just rich material, so thank you. And just to say, it's just really exciting for us to see how that relationship has really exploded in terms with your poetic relationship with Treby. So thank you so much. It's beautiful, really, really wonderful.